In Formula One, a driver touches a small dial on their steering wheel dozens of times every single lap, yet almost nobody watching notices it happens. It's called brake bias, and what sounds like a tiny technical detail is actually the difference between crossing the finish line first or slamming into a wall at 200 kilometers per hour. Today, we're lifting the lid on one of motorsport's best-kept secrets, the millimeter adjustments that separate champions from the rest. In the last few years, we've seen some of the closest championship battles in Formula One history. Drivers separated by single points, sometimes decided in the final lap. What most fans don't realize is that those margins aren't just about raw speed or tire management. They're about trust, feel, and the ability to break a 1,000-kilogram machine into a corner with absolute precision. Get the brake bias wrong by just half a millimeter, and the rear snaps loose. Get it right, and you gain a tenth of a second you can't get anywhere else. The drivers who master brake bias, who feel the car breathe and respond instantly, those are the drivers who win championships. Lewis Hamilton, Max Verstappen, Ayrton Senna before them. They all had one thing in common. They didn't just know their car, they understood how to talk to it through these tiny adjustments. And that conversation happens dozens of times per lap, invisible to everyone but the driver and their engineer. So what exactly is brake bias, and why does it matter so much? Imagine you're approaching a corner at 300 kilometers per hour. Your entire car, the chassis, the engine, the driver, wants to keep moving forward. That's inertia, and it's relentless. To slow down, you need friction. But here's the thing. Your car has brakes on all four wheels, and they don't have to work equally. Brake bias is simply the proportion of braking force sent to the front wheels versus the rear wheels. It's usually expressed as a percentage, say 55% front, 45% rear. But why not just split it 50-50 and call it a day? Because physics is far more complicated than that. When you brake hard, your car's weight transfers forward. The front tires become heavier and grip the track more fiercely, while the rear tires lose some of that downward push. So you can ask more of the front brakes without them locking up. Lock up a tire, and you've lost all friction with the track. You're just sliding. That's a disaster. Now here's where the engineer's dial comes in. On modern F1 cars, the driver can adjust brake bias using a small dial or paddle, usually on the steering wheel or behind it. Turn it forward, and more braking goes to the front. Why would a driver change this during a lap? Because conditions are constantly shifting. Early in a stint, when the tires are fresh and cold, the rear tires can grip well. So you might run 53% front, 47% rear. But as the tires heat up over several laps, as they wear down, as fuel burns off and the car gets lighter, that balance needs to change. A car that's heavy with fuel handles braking very differently from one that's nearly empty. The weight distribution changes, the forces change, and suddenly that bias that felt perfect 10 laps ago feels wrong. Push the bias too far forward, and you're asking so much of the front tires that they overheat and lose grip. You'll brake later than you'd like, miss the apex, and lose time. Push it too far back, and the rear tires can't handle the braking load. They lock up, or worse, they slide sideways while you're still trying to slow down. You're now aquaplaning toward the wall. The truly elite drivers sense this instability through the steering wheel, through their seat, through the subtle feel of how the car responds. And they make adjustments, sometimes 5, sometimes 10 times in a single lap. Tiny movements of that dial, each one a conversation with the machine. It's not something you can see on TV. There's no visual drama to it, no sparks, no squealing, but it's happening constantly, and it's absolutely fundamental to modern racing. Now, let's talk about moments when this adjustment mattered so much that the outcome of an entire race hinged on it. Take Monaco 1992, Ayrton Senna's final Grand Prix, driving for McLaren. The streets of Monte Carlo demand absolute precision under braking. There's no margin for error, no runoff, just unforgiving barriers waiting for any mistake. Senna's car felt unstable under heavy braking into the casino square. particularly as fuel load diminished through the race. He adjusted his brake bias multiple times that day, hunting for the sweet spot between stopping power and stability. One miscalculation in those conditions could have ended his race in a wall or cost him a podium finish. The sensitivity was extreme because the narrow street circuit amplifies every tiny imbalance. A 0.5mm shift, a 0.5% change in brake bias, and suddenly the rear is either too responsive or not responsive enough. Senna's ability to feel these changes and communicate them to his engineer gave McLaren the confidence to continue adjusting through the race. Fast forward to the 2016 season, Lewis Hamilton at the British Grand Prix at Silverstone. That weekend featured variable weather and multiple tyre strategy calls. Brake temperatures fluctuated wildly between wet and dry phases. Hamilton reported front brake overheating as fuel load decreased in his second stint. Mercedes adjusted his bias progressively further back to relieve pressure on the front axle. But they had to be careful. Push it too far and the rear becomes unpredictable under hard cornering entry braking. The team made at least 4 separate brake bias adjustments during that race, each one a calculated risk, each one requiring Hamilton to relearn how the car responded, to rebuild his confidence in how much he could ask of the brakes in those final critical corners. And then there's Michael Schumacher at the 2004 Japanese Grand Prix qualifying day. He reported erratic brake behavior early in his run, likely a small leak or temperature imbalance in the hydraulic system. Schumacher didn't abandon his run or complain. He adjusted his brake bias dial to compensate, finding a setup that let him work around the problem and still set one of the fastest laps of the session. That's the mark of a driver who truly understands what they're controlling. These weren't headline stories. The broadcasters never showed the bias dial moving. But behind every one of those performances was this constant, invisible conversation with the car. That's what separates good drivers from great ones. Now, here's a thought experiment that really brings this home. Imagine you're following Lewis Hamilton's entire second stint at Silverstone, but this time, the Mercedes engineers make a critical mistake. They adjust the brake bias too far toward the rear, just 0.5mm more than they should have. The car feels planted through the first few corners. Hamilton feels confident, maybe even better than before. But then, approaching Copse Corner, one of the fastest, most demanding corners on the calendar, he hits the brakes hard as he always does. Suddenly, the rear end wants to slide. Not dramatically, not immediately obvious to the naked eye, but enough that Hamilton has to lift off, has to brake earlier than he needs to. On a track where tenths of a second are the difference between pole position and fifth on the grid, that hesitation costs him everything. He'd still finish the race. The car wouldn't crash, but he'd never recover that lost confidence, and more importantly, he'd never recover those lost lap times. One tiny adjustment, invisible to everyone watching at home, would have changed the entire outcome of his weekend. That's the weight of this dial. So here's what you need to remember. Brake bias is the driver's conversation with their car, millimeter by millimeter, lap after lap. Second, never underestimate the smallest adjustments. A 0.5mm shift between confidence and a trip to the gravel trap. And third, this is what separates the legends from everyone else. The willingness to chase perfection in places no camera will ever show. Now we want to hear from you. Which aspect of driver technique should we explore next? Trail braking, throttle control, or something else entirely? Hit subscribe so you don't miss it, and drop your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for joining us in the paddock today.